And now, God, may your word be proclaimed either through me or perhaps in spite of me. Amen and amen. We're going to, you got to forgive Dave Throgmorton because following my script is difficult. And so I told him I don't know what I'm going to do because Matt put me on a time limit last night. He texted me and told me that he heard a rumor that I preach really long. And he said, he gave me like 23 minutes. Is what his text said, no longer than 23 minutes. It's going to be longer. So if you have somewhere to go, take off. My feelings won't be hurt. I can't see you leave anyhow. But so for those of you who were here when I was here, you might be surprised, if you don't know already because of Facebook, I have become a runner of sorts. Because even though I run, I don't enjoy any of it until the end. In fact, Jill the other day asked me, I was in Florida checking on my stepdad, and I ran along the river. And when I was finished, she texted me, she said, "Did you get the runner's high?" And I said, "Baby, I get the runner's high only when I finish. I don't enjoy running. I think running is still silly. When I was here, I had a theory that I shared with some of you that I believe God only gives you a certain number of heartbeats. Why waste any of them running? And but as a gift to my love of my life, as a gift to Jill, I started running. I surprised her by signing us up for a 5K run through a vineyard where you got wine at the end. It was really interesting. And I practiced like incognito for a while. She didn't know I was practicing, that I was running without her knowing. I kind of had this whole thing worked out, and then she busted me when she found out I had these running shoes in my closet that I didn't know she would find. But we ran the half marathon last January, and I had a goal, 3 goals. 1, to finish the race. 2, to not have a heart attack and die. And 3, to not puke. And I met all 3, and we're pretty excited. But I ran to be with her and as a gift to her. And for the half marathon, we raised money for Leukemia Lymphoma Society, which is very dear to our hearts, being that Jill works in leukemia at MD Anderson. And we raised almost $3,000. My goal for this year when I run is to raise over $8,000. So I'm going to just start hitting all you guys up. So get your checkbook ready. You'll see it on my Facebook page, and you'll get an email. But I want to raise between $8,000 and $10,000 for leukemia lymphoma. So that way, when I'm running the half marathon, at least it won't be as bad because I'm doing something good. But when I was training for that 5K, I decided I needed shoes, the right kind of running shoes, because if I'm going to do it, I want to do it right. So I did some research, and what I discovered is something that really intrigued me. I read that it is healthier and better for you to run barefoot. Now, I thought that was highly interesting, and what I discovered is that a lot of shoe companies understand that, and so they make shoes that imitate as if you're running barefoot, because for whatever reason, it's healthier. Well, I was kind of curious, being a barefoot type of guy, growing up in the beach land of Florida and never wearing shoes, I began to try to figure out, well, what's healthier about going barefoot? So I did some research, and I found some studies. And for those of you who do not go barefoot, you are missing out on wonderful opportunities to be healthy. They have shown that going barefoot will actually lower your blood pressure. Did you know that? It gives you better posture. It strengthens your feet, your legs, and your core. You're in better shape when you go barefoot. You sleep better. For some reason, it helps with jet lag. I haven't figured that one out. But my favorite thing that I found, there was a study, and I'm not exactly sure how they did the study, but there was a study that showed your life expectancy was longer if you went barefoot. So now when someone gives me grief about going barefoot, my question to them is, why are you wearing shoes and being unhealthy? Maybe you should do the right thing and just kick your shoes off. So I'm wondering, how many people are wearing shoes now? Matt has his shoes on. There's a miracle. I give you permission right now, Matt, take them off. In fact, anybody who wants to take their shoes off, go ahead, take them off. Because what we're going to study, we're going to look at Moses, and we're going to look to see about Moses. Because, well, some of you know the story, and some of you might not. But Moses didn't always go barefoot. Not his entire life. At the beginning of his life, when he was a kid and growing up, you got to remember, he grew up in the Pharaoh's home. He was among the rich. He was with the wealthy, the famous, the well-to-do, the people in power. And in those days, people in power, people with money, wore not just sandals, they wore the finest sandals money could buy. And that's what Moses wore his entire life, up until one day when he encountered God and he kicked his shoes off and his life was never the same. Now, before we get to that story, I've got to give you a little background for those of you who may not know Moses well. Moses was born in a time when the Pharaoh was threatening to kill every baby boy under the age of 2. And Moses' mom was worried about that, and so she hid him. And when she could no longer hide him, she made a boat, a basket, if you will, she weaved a basket together and placed Moses into the basket and floated him down the river, hoping that somehow he would be safe, knowing that that was his only chance. Well, he floated, and the oddest thing happened. There by the river was Pharaoh's daughter, the princess. And she saw this baby in this basket, and she was overcome. And she took the baby, and she hugged the baby, and she decided she was going to keep this baby, and she named him Moses. But she didn't know anything about raising a baby. Moses' sister heard about this. And as soon as she could, his sister went to the Pharaoh's daughter and says, look, I got an idea. You need help raising that son. I know someone who will do it for you if you pay her. And the princess was overcome with joy and said, I would love that. And lo and behold, Moses' sister introduced Moses' mother to the Pharaoh's daughter, and Moses' mother, if you read the story, ended up raising Moses while getting paid for it. Not a bad gig. How would you like that, Terry? You could raise your 3 children and get paid for doing it. It's a good job if you can get it. So Moses was raised in the court of the Pharaoh. He was raised as a son of the Pharaoh. In fact, he was called the Prince of Egypt. But he was raised by his mom. And where Exodus doesn't go into details, in my mind, I like to think that as Moses was being raised by his mom, he was taught about the Hebrew people. He was told the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And that he actually learned about Yahweh, the God of the Hebrew people. And that's where Moses grew up. Now, that's a great story, except Moses, at least I imagine, had to feel kind of not belonging anywhere, right? Because he knew he was an Egyptian, so he didn't belong to those people. No one knew that he was Hebrew, so he didn't belong to those people. He was just kind of, he was in what I would like to call, he was in exile. He had no family, he had no real home, he had no idea who he really was or what he really was or what he was about or what he was supposed to do. But he knew he was Hebrew at his very roots, which is why in the story, one day when Moses sees an Egyptian guard beating a Hebrew slave, Moses loses his mind, kills the Egyptian guard, which, by the way, wasn't highly looked upon as a good thing to do, killing an Egyptian guard. And so Moses did what any of us would do. He just ran. And as he ran, he he found himself in a land called Midian, which is right up here, geographically speaking. And when he stopped there, the reason why he stopped is he was getting some water, and there were these 7 sisters, and he rescued them, saved them, and they were so appreciative of what he did. They took him home to meet the family so that the family could thank him. Well, one thing leads to another, and he ends up marrying one of the sisters, Zipporah, and they settle down in Midian. So now Moses was married, living in Midian, but still didn't know who he was because well, in fact, it was a little worse now because he wasn't an Egyptian and he couldn't go back to there because they were going to kill him. He wasn't with Hebrew people and they didn't like him because they thought he was an Egyptian. And now he's living with this family in Midian who he wasn't really part of, because when they introduced him, they didn't introduce him as Moses. They said that Egyptian. And so he marries Zipporah. His father-in-law likes him but doesn't really embrace him. They have a child. They name the child Gershom, which means foreigner or alien or stranger, which is a pretty depressing name, if you will. And to make matters worse, Moses himself says he's a stranger in a foreign land, that he has no home, he has no family, he has no community, and he feels alone, right? And so that's the background of the story. And then one day Moses is out watching his father-in-law's sheep, and God approaches him. God calls him. He encounters God. And you can find the story in Exodus chapter 3, but we're not going to read that. Instead, I want you to watch how these people show it.
I am that I am. I am the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have seen the oppression of my people in Egypt and have heard their cry. So I have come down to deliver them out of slavery and bring them to a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And so unto Pharaoh I shall send you. Who am I to lead these people? They'll never believe me. They won't even listen. I shall teach you what to say. But I was their enemy. I was the prince of Egypt, the son of the man who slaughtered their children. You've chosen the wrong messenger. How can I even speak to these people? Who made man's power? Who made the deaf, the mute, the seeing, or the blind? Did not I? Now go!
So Moses has this encounter with God. And before the encounter happens, God tells Moses to take off his shoes. And the reason why God told Moses to take off his shoes, according to the story, is because Moses was standing on holy ground. I think that's fine. But well, if you know me and you've been around and you've heard my preaching, I always believe there's something else going on. And so I looked at this story and I thought, okay, what else can possibly be going on? And I looked at how Moses' life was transformed. So I did some research, Matt, and I discovered that most scholars and most preachers say the reason why Moses' life was transformed was because God called him and he finally knew what his purpose was in life, right? Now, I think that's great, but I can't speak for any of you, but my life wasn't really transformed when God called me into ministry because I still didn't understand it. I knew what I was supposed to do, and I know what I was supposed to do, and I understand my calling that way. But my real transformation didn't happen to years later. So I kept looking at this story. And I have a theory. Because you got to remember, Moses was, well, he believed he was an exile, that he was an alien, a foreigner, a stranger, that he didn't belong there and he didn't belong there and he didn't belong there and he had nowhere and he just felt alone, even though he was married with kids and had this. He never really knew who he was. But all that changed that day. And I think it changed the minute God said to him, take off your shoes. Because in those days, even like today, but in those days, when you went to someone's home and they invited you to take off your sandals, to take off your shoes, they were telling you that you're at home, that you're among a family, that you're part of this group. See, if the relationship was that intimate, they would then say, take off your shoes. And so what I think happened in that moment when God said, take off your shoes, Moses' life was changed because for the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged. He no longer felt in exile. He no longer felt like he was a stranger or a foreigner. He now knew who he was, a child of God. And the most incredible thing about that scene, if you watch Prince of Egypt, is at the very end of the scene, after God is finished calling Moses and Moses leaves, you know what they did? He left and never put his sandals back on. His sandals stayed in the same place because he didn't need them anymore. Because he understood that God was with him wherever he went and that he would always have a home with God. He understood who he was as a child of God. He understood what I tried to teach you guys for the 5+ years I was here. Every Sunday, the same message. We ended the service the same way. And I told you then, and I'll tell you now, if you remember nothing else but the 5+ years, that the only thing that really matters is that you remember that you're a child of God and that there is nothing you can do that will ever make God love you less. Because that God sees and thinks you are the best of the best of the best. And that's what Moses learned that day. Now, I've also learned that being in exile doesn't mean you're just on a foreign land. You can be in exile right here in Sugar Land, or Missouri City, or in Houston, or wherever, or Needville, or Richmond, or Rosenberg. See, being in exile isn't a physical thing. It's a spiritual thing, a mental thing, an emotional thing. And I know some of you well enough, and I know what some of you have gone through during the time I was here and the time since. And you may not be willing to admit it to anyone else, but I know. I know there are times in your life where you feel in exile, where you feel alone, where you feel like you are just there. You don't belong there. You don't belong there. You don't belong there. And the reason why I know that is because I felt it. Those of you who know my story know that I felt it from an early age. You know, when my dad abandoned me, I spent my entire childhood and young adult years trying to prove that I was worthy, achieving more than my talent would allow me to achieve, so that someone would say to me, "You are worthy, you're good enough, you're smart enough," whatever. Because I never felt like I belonged. And then I finally started feeling like I belonged and became somewhat successful, whatever that means in ministry, however you judge that. And then my life fell apart again. I went through a divorce. If not for Mac's dad, I wouldn't be here today. Between what Mark and what Bishop Norris said to me. But I had to learn myself that I was no longer in exile, that I wasn't a foreigner. I might have failed at a marriage, but I wasn't a failure. And so I read this text, I hear this story, and when I finally could grasp and fully believe that I belonged, that not only was I called by God, I was chosen by God. Not only was I called by God, chosen by God, I was embraced by God. And that God invites me to take my shoes off, to go barefoot, because He is with me and I have a home with Him. See, that's when my life was changed. I think that's when Moses' life was changed. And I think all of us here need to, at one time or another, be reminded of that. For 5.5 years, or however long it was, September 2008 to December 1st, 2013, I try to teach you that because I believe that's the heartbeat of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what I believe. One day Moses learned that he was no longer in exile, and he kept his shoes off. One day I learned that I was no longer a foreigner or a failure because God encouraged me to just kick my shoes off. There are people out here this morning who would understand the exact same thing, and they've learned the same thing. And there's other people who've never heard the good news of that. So I invite you this morning to just, what the heck, go barefoot. Go barefoot because A, it's healthier, right? You live longer, your blood pressure is lower, you sleep better, you get over jet lag, you stand up straighter, your gut is better, your legs are stronger. Go barefoot. And go barefoot because Matt's right, you're standing on holy ground. But most of all, go barefoot because you have a home. You have a God who says that there is nothing you can do that will ever make me love you less. Nothing. And I believe if you go barefoot and you get real quiet, I believe you just may hear God say to you, I am with you, even to the very end of time. See, and that changed my life. That changed his life. And that can change your life. That's what I believe. That's what I think the core of the gospel is. And that's the very truth that my faith is built on. Go barefoot. It's okay. Because you're home. In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit.